Welcome, everyone, to Hear It Podcast number 3, The Dramatic Pause. I am Brian Coughlin, and I am very excited today. I'm really excited to be bringing you this story, this particular conversation, in part because it's a repeat / continuation of a story I told actually last night at the Celtic Knot here in Evanston, Illinois. They have a storytelling time about once a month, and I was lucky enough to be able to join them yesterday, and they were really gracious, great audience, and a lot of fun to be able to just tell them this story about the dramatic pause, and a story really about my dad. That's in part something that's led to me doing the podcast, to doing Hear It, to creating Auto Clarity, and this kind of like venture with a new style of content. So super excited. And very much so thankful to them. And I'm excited as well, of course, because just the podcast as well as the app are finally out on iOS and Android. I'm extremely excited. I had, I think, 7 versions of the iOS app get rejected before I was accepted. So, a lot of hard work, but it's always okay that it happens since it finally got to the right result. And in addition to that, my first novel, Auto Clarity, is also published on Kindle as of about 2 days ago. So really exciting times, starting to see sales come in and starting to see some real growth. So really excited. So without further ado, I wanted to talk about the dramatic pause and really how my dad was an expert at the dramatic pause. Part of that was because, my dad was a storyteller. Not necessarily that he was a great storyteller. Sometimes he was just a really long and involved storyteller. He'd go off on tangents over everything. And he'd pause quite a bit and gather his thoughts, but he would do it in a way that, he didn't want to lose, if you will, control of a conversation. And my dad was a lawyer, and I think that's part of it. As a lawyer, he had to always have kind of control of a conversation in a courtroom, and he learned things, I think, and maybe it was subconscious, maybe it was just the way he was because he wanted to, keep talking, but he would use a lot of times like conjunctions to just hold you. So, not finishing, what he's saying or taking the pause at the end of a sentence or at the end of a thought, but rather right in the middle. And so he'd say, but, and I was like, but what, Dad? Come on, keep going. He'd kind of gather his thoughts. And it wasn't necessarily to be dramatic. I think it was mostly to keep control of the conversation, but it taught me things. And he would tell these really long stories. And there was one particular story. It was 20 years or so ago. I was 15 years old, and we were doing we were on a trip in the summer, driving up to northern Minnesota, just the two of us. Yeah, I was 15, and so I was driving for the first time. I had my learner's permit. And at one point, and this is an 11-hour drive from Chicago up to like northern Minnesota, so that's a good long drive. And I'm probably an hour and a half or so into it, and I just pointed out on the car in front of us, there was a DuPont bumper sticker. My dad had actually worked for DuPont shortly after he graduated college. In college, he got a degree in chemical engineering, and he was a chemical engineer for a couple of years before becoming a lawyer. So, he started telling me basically the entire friggin' history of the DuPont Corporation, and then some of his experiences there and the different things they would make, and again, like companies like that, you don't always know what they do. They're huge names, and a chemical company, they make things like plastic. Like it's just stuff that you use for everything. And they make even things like vinegar or other stuff. I don't know if DuPont does, but I remember him telling me about that too. He paused and he said, "What was it?" And that's another good point. He paused. So there's also vinegar. You got to get that perfectly right. For salad dressing. And I remember sitting there and I was like, I think I was trying to get him to just end this thing. It was probably 2 hours later. And I kind of wanted to just listen to music or something. And there was nothing on the radio. And I remember, and that's another thing, and he paused and I was like, what? And salad dressing. I'm like, what does this have to do with anything? And I still don't fully understand, but he pivoted to salad dressing, and that had to do with Paul Newman, who of course makes, the Newman's Own salad dressing. And where we were going in northern Minnesota, Paul Newman used to come up there and he'd race cars. And so we got to talking about that. I mean, just he kept going from one thing to another, just kind of on these ever weaving, tapestry of things he knew about, I guess. And And then he started talking about the car racing, and I was 15, so again, I'm on my learner's permit, and we're driving long distance. I think this is sort of like a fatherly moment or whatever, or a moment for him to impart some wisdom, let's say. But I remember him telling me that he was talking about like driving safe, and it can be really dangerous, like even if you're not doing stupid things when you're driving. And he had a court case, or again as a lawyer, and his client, and from what I remember, him telling me a bit about it, it was a young woman whose husband had passed away. He had been killed in a car accident. And he was just like, it was like one morning, he was on his way to work. I think he was an electrician, not a rich guy or anything, just living in the Chicago suburbs. And, he and his wife, she was a young wife, and they had 3 kids, 3 little girls, all under the age of 5. And he died just one morning. He was sitting at a stoplight and some car swerved, whatever it was. And there was something, I think they were suing like the insurance company or something, whatever it was. And he lost the case. But he kind of told me, he's like, even if you're doing everything right and you're just sitting there at a stoplight, totally legal and everything else, you could still get hurt. So, don't do stupid things to increase those chances, that type of thing. But he told me that. And I remember he would pause, and, they had 3 little girls. They're all under 5 years old. And he just lost the case. And I think, we talked probably a little about that. And it would have been a lot of money if he had won the case. He would have made a lot. And, with losing it, he didn't make anything. And I think, money was tight, and there was some of that. And I was 15, so yeah, I was, like, oh man, if you made all that money, you could get me a car when I turned 16. That was where my mindset was. And, I think he kind of, acknowledged that or whatever, but he kind of pointed back at them, like those, they had those little girls, and their dad was dead. And though he had been able to get them some money, there was different like insurance claims or whatever, but the big one, the more money they really needed, they didn't end up winning. And he said, they didn't get enough. They didn't get enough. I remember him saying that, and he held that, and he kind of looked out the window. It's almost like he's saying it to himself more than saying it to me. Like he let him down. And maybe it was a case that couldn't be won. I don't really know all the details, but they didn't get enough. And he really paused on that, and I think that had an effect on me. But then, from that, I think I learned, because he took that pause, he took that break, and it wasn't his usual, conjunction. It was a nice day, but it was serious. And it taught me the value of that from a storytelling perspective, because, if something is grave, it should have gravity. It should be taken seriously. And if it's painful or if it's sad, you should pause on it. That's not a thing you should keep moving on. And when you write a story, when you're a writer, you can't always count on the audience to read your book the way you intend for it to be read. You can't totally control that. You try to with your language and this and that, but they might just keep going and not get what you intended. And that's the way of the world. But we do have at our disposal, the ability to tell a story, orally, with an audiobook or a podcast, where you can connect a lot closer, because that's the point. Why are you reading that fiction? Why are you reading that story? Why bother if you're not trying to connect or enjoy it, have something, see the world through those characters' eyes or whatever it is. And that's, I think, really affecting. And it's really affecting for me. And again, it taught me the value of having, language itself, and just having a pause where if something is kind of painful, letting, the reader, and you yourself as the author or the reader or the speaker, sitting in that uncomfortable, painful moment, because it is uncomfortable and it is painful. And it's not a thing you should avoid. Not to say that you want to run to it and always have things be painful, but you don't want to act like nothing's ever wrong. You have to embrace that it is, so you can fight and try to make it better. And sometimes that means that you need to pause. And so I think that for Hear It, for Auto Clarity, for a lot of what I'm doing, there's a very strong or big component of what I'm doing is to try to get these other parts of our topics or our storytelling, include them into the story and really tell it the way I want to. People sat around campfires for hundreds of thousands of years or whatever and told each other stories. That's where language came from, and passing on information and knowledge from one generation to another. And the dramatic pause is an important tool for telling a good story. So don't, I think for me, it's very important to not ignore it and not to ignore those other opportunities for a good storyteller to take advantage of all of our tools that are at disposal to tell our stories. So very much so, I had a lot to learn from my dad, and I'm glad I did. And I'm glad he talked about some of those things and he showed me those things, and sometimes he took the pause and he meant it, when he was trying to say something. Even if I didn't get it, I think, I could kind of understand what he was feeling. And sometimes you need to take a moment to feel that. So, thank you for joining me on this latest podcast. And I hope you try out the dramatic pause a lot more in your own life. And it's certainly fine to end on a really odd note with a dramatic moment where people think that there's going to be more coming afterwards, but then there isn't. And that's another thing.